The storm clouds over Oak Creek weren't just weather. They were a death sentence for the season's profit. Silas Blackwood stood before his $500,000 German planter, a paralyzed giant of steel and sensors that refused to drop a single seed. He screamed that only a specialist from Berlin could touch its complex circuitry. He was wrong. When a battered pickup truck rolled onto the property, driven by a widow with grease under her fingernails and a debt collector's notice in her pocket, Silas laughed. He didn't know that the woman stepping out of that truck held a secret that would not only fix his machine, but unearth a betrayal buried deep in the soil of his own farm. This isn't just a story about repair. It's about how pride almost cost a man everything. The muddy boots of Silas Blackwood stomped across the gravel of the main yard, kicking up dust that swirled in the humid Nebraska air. It was mid-April, the most critical window for corn planting, and the sky to the west was bruising purple, a promise of heavy rain that would turn the fields into unworkable glue for weeks. If the seed wasn't in the ground within 48 hours, the yield loss would be catastrophic. Silas was a man who believed in two things: land and superior engineering. He didn't drive the domestic tractors his neighbors used. He imported. Sitting dead center in his massive machine shed was the Horsch Maestro SW, a German-engineered marvel of precision agriculture. It was massive, painted a vibrant red, capable of planting 48 rows at once with sub-inch accuracy. It was the envy of the county, and right now it was a $500,000 paperweight. "Get me the dealership, now." Silas roared at his foreman, a wiry older man named Bill, who looked like he'd been carved out of dried tobacco. "I called 'em, boss," Bill said, wiping sweat from his forehead with a stained rag. "They said the software diagnostic is showing a code 99 Delta. That's a proprietary lockout. The local boys in Omaha can't bypass it. They say it's a factory-level security freeze." Silas' face went a shade of red that matched his planter. "A security freeze? I own the damn thing. I paid for it cash. They say it triggers if the sensors detect a voltage irregularity. It shuts down the ECU to prevent damage," Bill explained, reciting the technical jargon he clearly barely understood. "They said they have to fly in a technician from the regional hub, a guy named Kraus. He's the only one certified to unlock the 99 Delta." "When?" Silas barked. Bill flinched. "Tuesday. Next week." "Tuesday?" Silas laughed, a hollow, terrifying sound. "Look at that sky, Bill. It's going to pour 3 inches by tonight. If we wait until Tuesday, we lose the window. That's $2 million in crop potential gone. Tell them I'll pay double, triple." "I tried, Silas. Kraus is in North Dakota fixing a combine. He can't get here." Silas slammed his fist against the massive tire of the planter. The rubber barely vibrated. He felt helpless, a sensation he despised more than anything. He was the biggest landowner in 3 counties, yet he was being held hostage by a line of code and a technician 2 states away. "There has to be someone else," Silas hissed. "What about the mechanic in town?" "The old shop." Bill hesitated. "You mean Miller's Repair?" "Yes, Miller. Tom was a good mechanic. Maybe he can figure out the wiring, bypass the sensor." Bill looked down at his boots. "Tom died 8 months ago, Silas. Heart attack. You were at the funeral." Silas paused. The stress had made him forget. "Right. Well, who runs the shop now?" "Did he have a son?" "His wife." "Audrey," Bill said quietly. "She's been keeping the doors open. Mostly doing oil changes on sedans and fixing lawnmowers." Silas scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "A widow fixing lawnmowers? I need a master technician, not someone who changes spark plugs on a riding mower. This is a German computer system, Bill. It's fiber optics and CAN bus networks. You think Audrey Miller knows how to read a German schematic?" She's the only one within 50 miles who's picking up the phone, Silas. Everyone else is booked for planting. Silas looked at the sky again. The wind was picking up, cold and sharp. The smell of rain was thick. He had no choice. Call her, Silas spat, the words tasting like bile. Tell her, if she scratches the paint or shorts a board, I will sue her for every penny she has left. Audrey Miller wiped her hands on a rag that was already black with oil. Her shop, Miller's Ag and Auto, was a chaotic sanctuary of metal parts, old hydraulic hoses, and the smell of stale coffee. Since Tom passed, the silence in the shop had been deafening. Local farmers, men who had trusted Tom with their livelihoods for 30 years, had slowly stopped coming. They didn't say it to her face, but she knew what they thought. Farming was a man's world, and heavy diesel mechanics was the inner sanctum. They didn't think a 40-year-old woman, even one who had spent 20 years handing Tom wrenches and reading manuals over his shoulder, could handle the talk and the tech. The phone on the wall rang, a harsh, jarring sound. Audrey stared at it. It was the bill collector's, surely. The bank had called yesterday threatening foreclosure on the shop building. She had 2 weeks to come up with $4,000, or she'd lose the only thing Tom had left her. She picked it up. Miller's Repair. Audrey, it's Bill over at the Blackwood place. Audrey stiffened. Silas Blackwood was known for 2 things, paying late and yelling loud. Hello, Bill. What can I do for you? We got a situation. The big horse planter is down. Electronic blockout. Silas is... Well, you know Silas. He's desperate. Audrey felt a knot in her stomach. Bill, that horse is fully computerized. I don't have the proprietary diagnostic laptop for that brand. Nobody does except the dealer. I know, Bill lowered his voice. But he's gonna lose the crop, Audrey. He says if you can come out and take a look, just see if it's something physical, he'll pay the emergency rate. The emergency rate, that could be $500 just for the call-out. It wouldn't save the shop, but it would keep the lights on for another month. I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said. Audrey grabbed her heavy toolbox, the one Tom had given her for their 10th anniversary, and threw it into the back of her rusted 2015 Ford F-150. She grabbed her laptop, not a dealer tool, but loaded with aftermarket diagnostic software she had spent nights coding herself, learning from forums on the dark web of tractor hackers. Farmers all over the world were fighting for the right to repair, breaking into their own tractors just to fix them. Audrey had become a silent expert in the underground movement. When she pulled into the Blackwood estate, the first raindrops were hitting the windshield. Silas was standing by the shed, arms crossed, looking like a thunderstorm himself. Audrey stepped out. She wore coveralls that were 2 sizes too big and a cap pulled low. She didn't look like a savior. She looked like a tired woman fighting a losing battle. I told Bill to call a mechanic, Silas said, not bothering with a greeting. Not a charity case. Audrey didn't flinch. She had dealt with men like Silas her whole life. You want it fixed, or you want to insult me. My rate is $150 an hour starting now. Double if you watch over my shoulder and complain. Silas' eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to being talked back to. It's a code 99 Delta. The dealer says it requires a German technician. You think you can outsmart the engineers at Horsch. I think the engineers at Horsch aren't standing in a Nebraska field with rain coming, Audrey said, walking past him toward the massive red machine. She approached the planter. It was beautiful, intimidated, and silent. She ran her hand along the hydraulic lines. She could feel Silas hovering behind her, radiating skepticism. Don't touch the ECU box, Silas warned. If you break the seal, the warranty is void. Your warranty is useless if you can't plant, Audrey muttered. She climbed up the side of the machine, popping the panel that covered the main wiring harness. She plugged her laptop into the diagnostic port. The screen flickered with streams of data. It was encrypted, a wall of digital gibberish. Most mechanics would have packed up right then. "Well?" Silas sneered from the ground. "Do you even know what you're looking at?" "Quiet," Audrey said sharply. She wasn't looking for the code to make sense. She was looking for noise. Voltage spikes. If the sensor triggered a lockout, it was because it sensed a surge. Surges didn't come from code. They came from bad grounds, frayed wires, all. And this was her hunch sabotage. Her eyes scanned the live data. The voltage on the rear starboard seed drive was fluctuating wildly. "Bill," Audrey called out, "bring me a flashlight." A bright one. Bill ran over and handed her a heavy LED torch. Audrey leaned deep into the chassis of the machine, twisting her body between the heavy steel beams. She shone the light into the dark recess where the main wiring loom passed through the frame. "What is she doing?" Silas demanded. "The computer is in the cab. Why is she digging in the axle?" Audrey ignored him. She saw it. A tiny glint of copper. It wasn't a frayed wire. It was a cut, a clean, precise incision in the insulation of the CAN bus high wire, just enough to expose it to the metal frame. Every time the machine vibrated, the copper touched the steel, shorted the system, and triggered the safety lockout. This wasn't wear and tear. A rat didn't chew a straight line. Someone had done this on purpose. Audrey pulled herself out, her face smeared with grease. She looked down at Silas. "You don't need a German technician, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice steady. "And you don't have a computer problem. What are you talking about?" "You have a traitor," Audrey said. "Someone cut your main data line. And judging by where it is, it was someone who knew exactly where to cut, so the dealer would think it was a software failure." Silas' face went pale. "That's impossible. No one touches this machine but me and Bill." Audrey climbed down, wiping her hands. "Then you better ask Bill where he was last night." The air in the shed suddenly felt colder than the storm outside. Bill took a step back, his eyes wide with fear. The silence that followed Audrey's accusation was heavier than the humid air pressing down on the tin roof of the shed. Outside, the first true crack of thunder split the sky, a sonic boom that rattled the heavy chains hanging from the rafters. But inside, the storm was entirely between three people standing in the shadow of the red steel giant. Silas Blackwood turned slowly toward his foreman. His movement was predatory, like a wolf realizing a sheep had been limping for too long. "Bill," Silas's voice was dangerously low. "You want to tell me why the lady thinks you're a saboteur?" Bill took a step back, his boots scuffing on the concrete. The old man's face, usually the color of tanned leather, had drained to the shade of wet ash. He held his hands up, palms open, as if to ward off a physical blow. "Silas, I swear on my mother's grave," Bill stammered, his voice cracking. "I didn't touch the wiring. I don't even know which wire is which. You know me. I'm a hydraulics man. Computers, they scare the hell out of me. You're the only one with the key to this shed besides me." Silas stepped closer, invading Bill's personal space. The wealthy farmer was a head taller than his foreman, looming over him. Who else could it be? A ghost? A drone? Audrey stayed perched on the side of the planter, looking down at the scene. She held the flashlight steady, keeping the beam focused on the severed wire deep in the machine's gut, but her eyes were on the men. She saw the rage in Silas, the desperate fear in Bill. But she also saw something else. "Hold on," Audrey said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had the sharp, metallic ring of a dropped wrench. It cut through the shouting. Silas looked up, his eyes blazing. "Stay out of this, Miller. You found the problem. I'll handle the personnel." "You're about to fire the wrong man," Audrey said calmly. She climbed down from the machine, moving with a deliberate slowness. She walked over to Bill, who was trembling so hard the keys on his belt loop were jingling. "Show me your hands, Bill," Audrey commanded gently. Bill looked at her, confused, eyes darting to Silas and back. "What? Your hands. Hold them out. Flat." Bill hesitated, then slowly extended his hands. They were gnarled, the knuckles swollen like knots in an old oak tree, the skin mapped with scars from 40 years of farming. And they were shaking. A rhythmic, uncontrollable tremor rattled his fingers. "Parkinson's?" Audrey asked softly. Bill nodded, shame coloring his cheeks. "Early stages. Doc diagnosed it last winter. I didn't want to tell Silas. I thought he'd put me out to pasture." Audrey turned to Silas, pointing a grease-stained finger at the foreman's shaking hands. "Look at that, Silas. Look closely." Silas frowned, his anger momentarily stalled by confusion. "So what? He's got the shakes. That just means he's clumsy. Maybe he slipped with a knife." "Come here." Audrey waved him over to the planter. "You need to see the cut." Silas grumbled but walked over. Audrey shined the light back into the recess of the chassis. "Look at the incision on the yellow wire," she instructed, her voice taking on the clinical tone of a surgeon. "It's not a jagged tear. It's not a slip. It is a single perfectly circumferential slice. The insulation was stripped back 3 millimeters without nicking the copper strands underneath. Then the copper was severed with a microcutter. It's surgical, Silas. It requires a steady hand and a magnifying glass." She turned back to Bill, who was still holding his trembling hands out. "Bill couldn't have made that cut if his life depended on it," Audrey stated flatly. "If he tried to strip that wire with those trimmers, he would have shredded the whole harness. He would have shorted the whole board." Silas looked from the wire to Bill's hands, the logic sinking in. The anger drained out of him, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. If it wasn't Bill, the loyal dog who had slept in the barn during calving season. "Then who? Then who?" Silas whispered, the question hanging in the ozone-charged air. The shed was locked. Bill lowered his hands, rubbing them against his jeans. "Silas, there was that guy last week, the consultant." Silas stiffened. "Carter?" "Carter is a soil agronomist. He was here to test the pH levels. He spent a lot of time in the shed," Bill said quietly. "While you were on the phone with the bank, he said he wanted to admire the German engineering. I didn't think nothing of it. He had a briefcase." Audrey watched Silas' face transform. The arrogance crumbled, revealing a flash of vulnerability. "Carter works for the Sterling Group now," Silas muttered, realizing the magnitude of the betrayal. "Sterling has been trying to buy my north acreage for 3 years. If I miss this planting window, if I default on the crop loan, they get the land at auction." Audrey finished the sentence for him. The reality of the situation shifted instantly. This wasn't just a broken machine. It was corporate sabotage. It was a hit job. Silas looked at the massive planter, then at Audrey. The look in his eyes changed. He no longer saw a woman in dirty coveralls who fixed lawnmowers. He saw his only lifeline. "Can you fix it?" Silas asked. His voice was no longer commanding. It was pleading. "If they cut the CAN bus line, the resistance is compromised. Even if you splice it, the computer might reject the signal strength. It's a data line, not a power cord." Audrey looked at the sky outside. It was almost pitch black, the storm unleashed. Rain was hammering the metal roof like machine gun fire. "I can fix it," Audrey said, closing her toolbox and picking up a smaller, more delicate case she had brought. "But I can't just twist the wires together and tape it. That will create signal noise. I have to rebuild the shielding. I have to solder it in place inside the frame without melting the other wires." She looked Silas dead in the eye. "And the power is going to go out any second," she said, nodding toward the flickering overhead halogens. I need you to hold the light. And Bill, I need you to find me a portable generator or a battery bank for my soldering iron. We have maybe 2 hours before the humidity in the air corrodes that exposed copper and ruins the ECU permanently. Do it, Silas said. Whatever you need. The interior of the machine shed had become a cavern of shadows and noise. The storm had fully descended on Oak Creek, wind howling through the gaps in the sliding doors, rattling the corrugated steel walls. The overhead lights had flickered and died 10 minutes ago, just as Audrey predicted. Now the only illumination came from the focused beam of the high-lumen flashlight Silas Blackwood held with a grip so tight his knuckles were white. Audrey was contorted into a shape that shouldn't have been comfortable for a human being. Her upper body was threaded through the gap between the planter's seed hopper and the main axle. Her cheek was pressed against cold red-painted steel. The smell of grease, damp earth, and ozone was thick in her nose. "Steady, Silas," she murmured. "Move the light 2 inches to the left. I need to see the sheen on the copper." "I'm trying," Silas grunted. His arm was burning from holding the heavy light at an awkward angle for 20 minutes, but he didn't dare lower it. He watched the woman work with a mix of fascination and shame. He had judged her based on her gender and her run-down shop. But watching her now, he realized he was watching a master at work. Audrey held a butane-powered soldering iron in her right hand, a tool she had to use because the power was out. It was trickier than an electric iron. The heat was harder to regulate. In her left hand she held a spool of silver-bearing solder, thinner than a human hair. "Why silver?" Silas asked, trying to distract himself from the anxiety gnawing at his gut. "Standard solder is lead tin. Silver has lower electrical resistance," Audrey said, not looking up. Her eyes were narrowed behind safety glasses, focused on the millimeter gap in the wire. "This is a data stream. It carries millions of packets of information per second. Standard solder creates a bottleneck. A bottleneck triggers the code 99 delta again. It has to be perfect, or it's nothing." She took a breath and held it. This was the moment, the widow's touch, Tom used to call it. Tom was strong, he could break a rusty bolt with one hand, but Audrey could thread a needle in a hurricane. She touched the iron to the wire. The resin core hissed a tiny, sharp sound lost in the thunder outside. The silver melted, flowing like liquid mercury, bridging the gap between the 2 severed ends of the green wire. She pulled the iron away instantly. "Cooling," she whispered. "Don't move." They waited in the dark, the flashlight beam illuminating a single drop of cooling metal. "You learned this from Tom?" Silas asked softly. The arrogance was gone from his voice, stripped away by the darkness and the dependency. Audrey exhaled, watching the soda turn from shiny liquid to a dull, solid matte. "Tom taught me how to read a schematic. He taught me the theory." She paused, reaching for a roll of heat-shrink tubing. "But the hands, the soldering?" "That was me. Tom had hands like bear paws. He couldn't do the microelectronics. He used to say, 'Audrey, you do the brain surgery, I'll do the bone setting.'" She slid the heat-shrink tubing over the repair and used the side of the butane torch to seal it. It was a perfect seal, watertight. "He was a good man," Silas said, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth. I didn't come to the funeral because I was in Chicago at an auction. I should have sent flowers." Audrey didn't respond immediately. She began rewrapping the harness with protective looming. "You didn't come because you thought he was just a grease monkey, Silas. And you thought I was just a grease monkey's wife." Silas didn't argue. There was no point. She was right. "I'm sorry," he said. It was the first time Silas Blackwood had apologized to anyone in a decade. Audrey finished the wrap and shimmied backward, pulling herself out of the machine's innards. She landed on the concrete floor, wiping sweat and grime from her forehead. She looked exhausted, a coverall stained, her hair escaping her cap. "Apology accepted," she said, standing up and stretching her back. "Now let's see if your German friend decides to wake up." Bill ran over from the corner, where he had been sheltering from the wind. "The battery bank is hooked up to the tractor cab, Audrey. We got enough juice to cycle the ignition." "Do it, Bill," Silas commanded, but he looked at Audrey for confirmation. Audrey nodded. "Turn the key. But don't start the engine yet. Just accessory power. Let the computer boot." Bill climbed up into the massive tractor that pulled the planter. He turned the key. The dashboard lit up. The screens inside the cab flickered to life. Audrey, standing on the ground, plugged her laptop back into the diagnostic port on the side of the planter. "Come on," she whispered, typing furiously. "Talk to me." The screen scrolled through the boot sequence. "System check. Okay. Hydraulics. Okay. GPS. Locked. ECU communication." The cursor blinked. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. The longest 3 seconds of Silas' life. ECU communication. Established. Status ready. Error codes none. We're green. Audrey shouted over the thunder. "The lockout is gone. The circuit is complete." Silas let out a breath that sounded like a sob. He slumped against the tire, the relief nearly knocking him over. The $2 million in crop potential was safe. The bank wouldn't take the farm. Sterling wouldn't win. "Fire it up," Silas yelled at Bill. "Let's hear the hydraulic cycle." Bill turned the key fully. The massive diesel engine of the tractor roared to life, shaking the floor. He engaged the PTO. The fan on the planter whirred into a jet engine scream, the sound of air pressure building to shoot seeds into the ground. The hydraulic arms lifted the massive wings of the planter, flexing them like a waking dragon. It was working. It was perfect. Audrey packed her laptop, her job done. She felt a deep, bone-weary satisfaction. She had done what the dealer couldn't. She had done what Silas thought impossible. Silas walked over to her. He had to shout to be heard over the engine. "You did it. You actually did it." "I'll send you the bill," Audrey said, grabbing her toolbox. "Emergency rate, plus the solder." "I'll pay it gladly." Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out a checkbook. He looked manic, high on the adrenaline of a near miss. "But Audrey, wait!" He looked toward the open door of the shed. The rain was coming down in sheets illuminated by the tractor's headlights. But through the rain something else was visible. Headlights. A vehicle was coming down the long driveway, not a truck. A sleek black SUV. It was moving fast, ignoring the mud and the potholes. Silas' smile vanished. "Who is that?" Bill leaned out of the tractor cab, squinting. "That ain't the dealer, boss." "That looks like." "That's a Lincoln Navigator," Audrey said, recognizing the grille shape. "City car." The SUV skidded to a halt right in front of the shed, blocking Audrey's truck. The door opened. A man stepped out into the rain. He wore a raincoat that cost more than Audrey's entire truck. He was tall, smooth-faced, and holding a large umbrella. Silas stiffened. "Carter," he hissed. And he brought his boss. The man under the umbrella wasn't Carter the consultant. It was Harlan West, the CEO of the rival farming conglomerate that had been trying to bankrupt Silas. And he wasn't alone. 2 other men stepped out from the back seat, big men, dressed in dark clothes that didn't look like farm attire. They weren't here to fix a tractor, and they clearly hadn't expected to see the planter running. Harlan West walked to the edge of the shed, staying just out of the rain. He looked at the roaring machine, then at Silas, and finally his eyes landed on Audrey. "Mr. Blackwood," Harlan smiled, a shark-like expression that didn't reach his eyes. "I heard you were having technical difficulties. I came to make an offer on the scrap metal." Silas stepped forward, grabbing a heavy wrench from a workbench. "Get off my land, Harlan. Or what? Harlan laughed. You're going to hit me with a spanner. I have a foreclosure notice in my car that says this land is effectively in default if you don't show proof of planting capacity by midnight. It's running, Silas shouted, gesturing to the machine. Is it? Harlan looked at the wire Audrey had just fixed, because my sources told me that machine suffered a catastrophic, unfixable failure. A permanent failure. He looked at Audrey. You must be the local help. I'd advise you to pack up and leave, Mom. This is corporate business. It gets messy. Audrey looked at the three men. Then she looked at her truck, blocked in. Then she looked at Silas, who was gripping the wrench but shaking with rage. She realized then that the sabotage wasn't just a cut wire. It was the first move in a hostile takeover, and by fixing the machine, she hadn't just saved a crop. She had put herself directly in the crosshairs of a war she didn't understand. I'm not going anywhere, Audrey said, stepping up beside Silas. She hefted her heavy metal toolbox in one hand, and the machine is fixed, so unless you want to explain to the sheriff why you're trespassing on a fully operational farm, I suggest you back that fancy car up. Harlan's smile dropped. He nodded to the two large men behind him. Disconnect it, Harlan said to his goons. Permanently this time. The standoff in the machine shed had shifted from a battle of wits to a battle for survival. The rain was no longer just weather. It was a curtain of noise that isolated the shed from the rest of the world. Inside, the roar of the tractor engine, idling at 200 RPM, created a vibrating bass note that shook the teeth of everyone present. Harlan West stood by the hood of his Lincoln, his expensive shoes slick on the wet concrete. He didn't look like a CEO anymore. He looked like a general ordering an execution. The two men he had brought thick-necked enforcers named Cale and Brody stepped into the light of the tractor beams. Cale held a crowbar he had pulled from the trunk. Brody just cracked his knuckles. Don't do this, Harlan, Silas shouted, brandishing his wrench. You touch this machine and I'll bury you under the jail. You're trespassing on corporate property, Harlan yelled back, his voice smooth and cold. Or it will be, once the foreclosure goes through tomorrow. Boys, cut the harness. If Mr. Blackwood gets in the way, subdue him. Brody charged. He moved with frightening speed for a big man. Silas swung the heavy wrench, a clumsy, desperate arm. Brody ducked under it easily, driving his shoulder into Silas' chest. The air left Silas' lungs in a sickening whoosh. He hit the ground hard, the wrench clattering away across the concrete. Brody pinned him, a knee driving into Silas' spine. Silas, Audrey screamed. Cale, the one with the crowbar, wasn't looking at Silas. He was walking straight toward the planter, eyes fixed on the wiring loom Audrey had just painstakingly repaired. He raised the crowbar, aiming to smash the delicate ECU box into plastic shards. Audrey looked around wildly. She was 10 feet away, holding nothing but a toolbox. She couldn't stop a 250-pound man with a crowbar, but she knew something Cale didn't. She knew the machine. Bill! Audrey screamed toward the tractor cab. Drop the markers. Now, Bill, freezing in the cab, his hands trembling on the steering wheel, stared at her wide-eyed. The panic attack had him locked up. Bill, the hydraulics. The right marker arm. Drop it. Her voice pierced through the fog of his fear. It was the voice of authority, the same tone Tom used to use. Bill's shaking hand slapped the hydraulic lever on the console, the SCV-3 control. Hiss clang. The Horsch Maestro was equipped with heavy steel marker arms-long, articulated metal beams designed to reach out 20 feet to mark the soil for the next pass. They were powered by thousands of pounds of hydraulic pressure. Kyle was standing right next to the machine frame. He heard the hiss of fluid a split second too late. The massive steel arm swung down from its upright locked position. It didn't move fast, but it moved with the unstoppable force of physics. It caught Cale across the chest, sweeping him off his feet like a rag doll. He flew backward, slamming into a stack of empty seed pallets. The crowbar flew from his hand. He groaned, winded and terrified, as the heavy steel arm pressed down, pinning him against the wood. The hydraulics hummed, holding him there with the weight of a car. "What the hell?" Harlan shouted, retreating behind his car door. Rhodey, seeing his partner taken out by the machine itself, hesitated. He looked up from pinning Silas. That second of distraction was all Silas needed. Silas Blackwood was 60 years old, but he had baled hay every summer since he was 12. He had old man strength, the kind of dense, roppy muscle built by decades of labor. He twisted his hips, bucking Brody off balance, and drove his elbow backward into the man's nose. Brody howled, clutching his face, blood spurting through his fingers. Silas scrambled to his feet, grabbing a shovel from the wall rack. He didn't look like a victim anymore. He looked like a cornered badger. "Get back," Silas roared, swinging the shovel. Audrey didn't wait. She ran to the tractor cab and scrambled up the steps, pushing past a stunned Bill. She grabbed the throttle lever. "Audrey, what are you doing?" Bill gasped. "Cleaning house," she muttered. She engaged the PTO, power takeoff, to full power. The fan on the planter screamed, the pitch rising to a deafening whine. The vacuum pressure system, designed to suck corn seeds onto the planting discs, was now moving a hurricane of air. Audrey reached for the clean-out valve switch on the monitor feature, used to blow excess seed out of the hoppers. She aimed the discharge chutes toward the open door where Harlan was standing. Whoosh. A blast of pressurized air mixed with dust, graphite lubricant, and leftover treated corn seeds erupted from the back of the machine. It hit Harlan West like a sandstorm. The CEO shrieked, covering his face as thousands of hard corn kernels pelted him at 60 miles per hour. It was like being shot with a shotgun loaded with rock salt. "Get in the car," Harlan screamed, diving into the Lincoln. "Go, go." Dash. Brody, nose broken and bleeding, scrambled up and limped toward the SUV. Cale, finally wriggling free from under the hydraulic arm, abandoned his crowbar and sprinted for the car, limping heavily. They piled into the luxury SUV, tires spinning on the wet concrete as they peeled out in reverse, fishtailing into the mud and disappearing into the rainy night. Audrey killed the PTO. The fan spooled down, the whine fading into silence. The only sound left was the heavy breathing of 3 people and the relentless rain on the roof. Silas lowered the shovel. He walked over to the doorway, watching the red taillights vanish. Then he turned around. He looked at the planter, then at the hydraulic arm that had saved them, and finally up at the cab where Audrey was sitting. He walked over to the tractor, reached up and opened the door. He offered a hand to help her down. "I have never," Silas said, his voice shaking with a mixture of adrenaline and awe, "seen anyone use a row marker as a baseball bat before." Audrey took his hand and hopped down. Her knees were weak, but she stood tall. "It's all about leverage, Silas. Just physics." The adrenaline crash hit them all about 20 minutes later, but there was no time to rest. The storm was passing, but the clock was still ticking. Silas called the sheriff to report the trespassing and assault. Handing over the security footage from the camera Bill had pointed out earlier, a camera Harlan hadn't noticed in the shadows of the rafters. With the video of the assault and the attempted property damage, Harlan West wouldn't be buying any farms anytime soon. He'd be fighting a felony indictment. But the real victory wasn't legal. It was agricultural. "The rain has stopped," Bill said, standing in the doorway, smelling the air. Wind shifted. "It's drying out." Silas looked at his watch. "It's 2 a.m. If we start now, we can get the South 40 planted before dawn. He looked at Audrey. She was packing her tools, her face smeared with grease, her hands trembling slightly from the aftershocks of the fight. "You're free to go, Mrs. Miller," Silas said formally. "I'll mail the check tomorrow. A big one." Audrey snapped her toolbox shut. "Good. I have a mortgage to pay." "Wait," Silas said. He stepped between her and her truck. "You know Bill. Bill's not going to be able to run the shop much longer. Not with his hands getting worse." Bill nodded sadly from the side. "It's true, boss. I can drive, but I can't fix." Silas looked at Audrey. "I have 5 tractors, 2 combines, this planter, and a fleet of trucks. I spend about $80,000 a year on maintenance with the dealership. They overcharge me, and they treat me like a number." Audrey narrowed her eyes. "What are you getting at, Silas?" "I'm offering you a contract," Silas said. "Exclusivity. You take over the maintenance for Blackwood Farms. All of it. I'll build you a heated bay right here on the property if you want, or I'll pay to upgrade your shop in town. Retainer fee plus hourly." Audrey paused. A contract like that wouldn't just save her shop, it would secure her future. It would mean she could hire an apprentice, maybe take a day off for the first time in 2 years. "I don't work for bosses who yell at me," Audrey said sternly. "I won't yell," Silas promised, a rare smile cracking his weathered face. "I might grumble, but I won't yell. And I'll never doubt your diagnostic skills again." Audrey looked at her hand, the hand that had held the soldering iron, the hand that had saved the farm. She looked at the giant German machine that was purring behind them. "Deal," she said, extending her hand. Silas shook it. "Now, get out of here. Go sleep. We have corn to plant." Iron. 6 months later. October. The Nebraska sky was a piercing, brilliant blue. The air was crisp, smelling of dried stalks and diesel. The harvest was in full swing. Audrey pulled her truck into the field edge. She wasn't wearing dirty coveralls today. She was wearing a clean jacket with a new logo embroidered on the chest, Miller and Associates, Heavy Ag Repair. She watched as the massive combine harvester chewed through the rows of corn. The yield monitor in the cab was reporting record numbers. 200 bushels an acre. It was a bumper crop. The impossible crop. The combine stopped, and Silas climbed down from the ladder. He looked younger than he had that rainy night in April. The stress of impending bankruptcy was gone. "Audrey," he waved. "Just in time. We blew a hydraulic hose on the grain cart." "I brought a spare," she called back, grabbing her tools. "Of course you did," Silas laughed. As she worked on the hose, Silas leaned against the tire. "You know Harlan West took a plea deal, probation and a massive fine. Sterling Group fired him. Couldn't happen to a nicer guy," Audrey said, tightening a clamp. "And," Silas hesitated, "I stopped by the cemetery this morning. Put flowers on Tom's grave." Audrey stopped turning the wrench. She looked up at Silas. "I told him," Silas said softly, "that his wife is the best damn mechanic in the state, and that I'm keeping an eye on her for him." Audrey felt a lump in her throat. She stood up, wiping her hands on a rag. She looked out over the ocean of gold corn stretching to the horizon. It was a sea of survival, grown from soil, sweat, and a single silver wire soldered in the dark. "Tom would have liked that," she said. "He would have liked that a lot." "Ready to roll?" Silas asked. "Always," Audrey said. "Fire it up." The engine roared to life, a song of power and redemption echoing across the plains. In the end, it wasn't the German engineering that saved the Blackwood farm. It wasn't the millions of dollars in equipment or the corporate contracts. It was a steady hand, a soldering iron, and the courage of a woman the world had written off. Audrey Miller proved that expertise doesn't always wear a clean uniform, And strength doesn't always look like a muscle. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is show up when everyone else has given up, and find the broken connection that needs mending. We all have broken wires in our lives, relationships, dreams, or projects that seem impossible to fix. But this story reminds us that with enough grit, knowledge, and a little bit of faith, even the darkest storms can end in a harvest of gold. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. It helps us bring more of these gritty, real-life dramas to you. What did you think of Audrey's quick thinking with the hydraulic arm? Would you have stood your ground against Harlan? Let me know in the comments below. And if you haven't already, subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story about the unsung heroes of the Heartland. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.